He pulled her out of the water before he understood why the sight of her made his chest loosen, as if someone had pried a door open inside him. Salt clung to the dark hair plastered to her face. Her breath came shallow and quick, a frightened bird trying to remember how to fly. Her dress, cheaper than the gowns he usually saw in the magazines that bore his company's name, was a soaked, heavy thing that clung to the lines of a kid who had not yet learned how to armor herself. For a moment, his mind supplied facts. She was 16, 17, no, 18. The number came like a ledger entry, precise and cold. She was 18, yet his fingers found the soft place where her shoulder met neck with the tenderness of someone who had always measured the cost of touch. "Hold on," he said. The words were useless against the water still trembling in the air, but they shaped the arc of the moment, a command, an offer, a vow. He had pulled a dozen things from worse depths in his life, bad deals, reputations, shipments that threatened to collapse an entire quarter. But this was not a contract to be renegotiated. This was a person had been pushed past the edge of endurance. She blinked at him as if recognizing a stranger and then a harbor. Her eyes were an uneven map, one corner still rimmed in salt, the other smudged with mascara and something that might be grief or cunning. He saw the tremor of a hand brush at her lips. He saw the tiny dent of a knuckle where a ring had once been. Someone had tried to claim her, then claimed nothing at all. "You're going to be all right," he told her. People expect CEOs to say practical things, numbers, schedules, strategies. This was not a meeting note. It felt like a prayer he had never learned to mutter. She laughed then, too small, brittle. "You saved me," she said, as if that were a verdict she had been waiting for. "Or you're—" her voice cut on the last word. She coughed, a ragged, frightened sound that turned to sobbing. "Going to arrest me." He couldn't fix everything with a power of signature or a board vote. He could call lawyers, but lawyers could not pull the cold out of a person who had nearly drowned in the harbor of her own shame. He looked at her and thought of the way the water stole heat and left a person bare. He looked at her and, absurdly, thought he might drown in her eyes. Then the world constricted to the practical. He saw the dock, slick wood, the moth-eaten paint of the railing, and the dark line of the town behind them. He felt the weight of his own suit, the leather of the shoes that had walked him through boardrooms and banquet halls, and the ridiculous imbalance of it all. A man used to holding kings of industry on a leash, kneeling on wet planks to wipe sea salt from the cheek of a girl with music-stained fingers. "Name," he said, slow and precise, that old CEO voice contouring itself over this unmanageable tenderness. "Tara Grant," she managed. The name fit oddly with the rest of the evening, like a note that resolves a chord but still leaves an echo. Grant. Like a legacy that had been pawned off in the same breath as a teacup. He gave her a blanket, his assistant's wool that he never would have believed he'd whistle to life for a stranger, and the edges smelled faintly of his car. He hadn't intended to get involved with the Grant family. Their affairs were for local papers, strategic philanthropy alliances, and occasionally uncomfortable dinners where he had to laugh at jokes that bit. Velmont's ledger rarely crossed with the petty cruelties of private estates. Yet here he was, in a place where the ocean met wood, and his hands were steady because his mind refused otherwise. "There's a first aid place up on Harbor Street," he said, because action was an easier syntax than feeling. "You need to be checked. Hypothermia, exposure, and—" he hesitated. "You shouldn't be alone." She shook her head, a quick, impatient motion that splashed damp against her temple. "No one will believe me," she said. "They'll make it worse. She broke off, and the pronoun hung heavy between them, an accusation and a plea wrapped in one. "My father, he'll make them believe him." A different calculation folded in his mind. Arrangements, reputation, heirs that were inconvenient. The Grants were not a family without teeth. Victor Grant moved pieces on a board most people couldn't see. His name opened butcher shops and charity galas alike. For someone like Victor, a scandal could be swept into the folds of a newspaper's small print if he chose to look the other way. But it seemed to the CEO, Henry Lane, that he had always been the sort of man who found the messy pages interesting. Problems with risk profiles could become leverage. "You can come with me," he said before he could talk himself out of it. "There's a clinic. Then my driver will take you to a safe place until you decide what to do." She searched his face, suspicion folding into something like calculation. "Why would you?" "Because I can," he interrupted. It was blunt. He would not pretend benevolence to himself. He owned firms that cleaned the reputations of worse people. Saving someone on a dock for reasons that were both visceral and strategic did not embarrass him. It intrigued him. Her laugh this time was softer. "A CEO who rescues people from the harbor, that's a tale for the tabloids." Her lips pressed together. Something in her jaw tightened, an old habit of bracing when the room threatened to tilt. "You could tell them I did nothing at all," he said. "You could tell them I wasn't there." She looked away toward the street where the sodium light painted the puddles in swimming gold. "They'd find you," she said. "They'll find everyone." He studied her hands then. There were faint white crescents at the knuckles, as if someone had tried to force her fingers into a shell. There were calluses softened by neglect, and a small jagged scar along the first joint of the left thumb, piano-like. Music left marks on her body the way storms left scars on docks. It explained the way she flinched when someone mentioned applause. "Do you play?" he asked. She stared at him with a guarded spark. "Once," she answered. "Used to. Before it broke." He made a note in his head he would not admit to anyone. He had seen the way her fingers had hovered over the railing moments before. He had watched her hands move as a pianist's hands do, as if returning to muscle memory. There was a rhythm to the way she closed her fist around the blanket, then loosened, like someone who had learned to measure pain and passion in equal beats. "Stay with me then," he said. "Let me get you out of the salt and into something warm." She didn't name the bargain she was making in her head, or the debts she bore unseen. Those were private calculations she kept to herself. For the moment she let him lead her away from the water, toward a night that smelled of diesel and old lemon oil, and she allowed herself the deception that help could be an absence of accusation rather than a new chain. 3 days earlier, the Grant house looked like a museum that had been taught to demand silence. They kept the piano in the drawing room under glass like a relic, an upright with ivory teeth that were more polished than a church pew, and strings that had been tuned the way a surgeon steeled his hands. Tara's mother had loved it in a way that turned worship into obsession. Lucy had practiced until her knuckles were raw, and until the pair of hands moved across the keys like weather. After Lucy's death, the piano became, for the family, a functioning altar, a place where grief and control intersected. Tara had once believed the piano would save her, not save in the way charity saved reputations, but save in the way art could stitch a person back together. The music had always been a map out of the gilded cage. She would play, and people would see her for herself, not as a liability or a ledger entry. At 18, she still believed in an audience as an honest thing. Her stepmother, Heidi, believed in appearances. Heidi cut a silhouette of authority in tailored dresses and detection glass smiles. She moved through rooms measuring the weight of glances and the arrangement of silver. Vivian Grant, sat at the opposite end of the house like a portrait come to life, pale, practiced, hands manicured and poised. Vivi had been the prodigy the family had wanted. A polished pianist who could charm a benefactor and marry advantage in a single rehearsal. She had the sort of social spine that thrives on others' collapses. When Tara arrived at the charity recital the family hosted, a perfunctory show of gentility for donors and local press, she was wearing a dress that tried to be invisible. Her sleeves hid the faint white crescent scars along her knuckles. Her hair was pinned back the way someone hides bones. She waited in the wings while Vivi accepted applause, and the house lights divided the room into admirers and spectators. The air smelled of lemon oil and perfume, and someone had set 2 glasses of water at the piano bench like a ritual. The pianist before Tara was Vivi, flawless. The audience applauded like a river folding over stone. Then it was Tara's turn. She approached the keys with the humility of a penitent. The first chord sounded, a small modest thing that should have been swallowed as a prayer. Instead she felt a shock of pain as something impossible bit into her palms. A spark, a laceration. The sound went wrong. The note split, thin and terrible. And then there was a bright, acrid scent like burnt sugar. She had only a second to register that the piano's keys had been tampered with. Hidden shards, a smear of acid in the places her fingers would fall before the applause curdled to an intake of breath. Blood welled on her fingertips. She tasted iron. She tried to pull away, but the reflex to play was a muscle memory that would not be quieted. She faltered, struck another wrong note, then doubled back to composition. The audience watched the unraveling with the precise cruelty good manners allows. Someone rushed her a handkerchief. Someone else clapped a patronizing hand on her shoulder. The stepmother's smile could have been a knife. Vivi's eyes flashed something like triumph and then confusion, as if she too had been taught to be surprised. Someone whispered about nerves. Someone said, sotto voce, that perhaps Tara had planned this. By the time she was led away, the pictures in the press had already been taken. Tara leaving the stage with blood staining her fingertips, Vivi stepping out in a white glove to accept the spotlight. Gossip would say she had staged the incident to win sympathy. The truth, the screws, the acid, the subtle cruelty, lived outside the narrative that the family would sell. Tara's hands throbbed. The doctor who patched them said it would take weeks to heal and that there might be nerve damage, an industry term for an identity fracture. He put her on pain medication and taped her thumbs like a crutch. When she pressed them to the keys in the solitude of the piano room that evening, the attack seemed like a forecast. The notes were not the same. Her fingers remembered a worst-case scenario and refused to obey. At Lucy's memorial 2 nights later, the tension snapped like a brittle wire. The house filled with people whose condolences smelled like profit. Victor Grant gave the eulogy with the practiced sigh of a man who had always fed his grief into something that advanced him. He praised Lucy in the way people commend virtues that don't cost them anything. Tara went to the casket because she had to. She wanted to lay a lacquered box of ashes the way a child leaves a poem on a windowsill. But grief in the Grant household had been monetized. Lucy's cremains were already a bargaining tool. Heidi had locked the little urn in a safe, a cruel bureaucratic checkmate to control the ceremony's optics. Tara's pleading for a private moment to scatter the ashes at the spot in the garden Lucy had loved was met with a smile so cold it could freeze wine. They said later that Tara's hands had always been dramatic. They said she was unwell, suggestible, inclined to theatrics. They said this while someone in the back quietly slid a small envelope into Vivi's palm. During the service, when the curtains at the memorial fluttered like a stage, someone tripped. The urn toppled from the platform. A younger relative cried out. The ashes spilled, a soft wind carrying them in a cloud that dissolved into the floral arrangements and the lacquered floor in equal measure. A photographer's camera flashed. The crowd gasped. In the seconds that followed, Heidi moved with the cruelty of a hand trained to make a silk dress look like porcelain. She turned toward Tara with a look of sanctioned horror. Vivi began to sob, exquisite and timed, with an actress's precision. By the time rumor stitched the day's events into a story, the headline was shaped. Grant heir's daughter causes outburst at mother's memorial. The insinuation hung like smoke. Tara, fragile and impetuous, had thrown her mother's ashes to the floor, desecrated the sacred, sought attention. People said she wanted revenge. Others, almost always those who stood to gain, called her unstable. Victor said nothing at first. He watched his daughter like a puzzle, calculating. Later, in the seclusion of his study, he would tell confidants that Tara's unpredictability was dangerous. He considered options. Silence her with money, with placement, with public statements that reframed her as unwell or as an impediment to Vivi's career. Victor had, over decades, perfected a way to curate scandal into a means of consolidation. He had not expected his own blood to become a liability. Tara left the memorial hollowed out as if someone had scooped something essential from inside her. She went to Lucy's old room, where every object seemed to ask her a question. Why rescue a memory when it had betrayed you? She thought of the piano, of the hands that had been taken from her. She considered the safe where the urn had been kept and the way Heidi had smiled when it fell. She felt manipulated by a family who measured lives in returns. That night she tried to steal back what she could. The ashes, the thing that felt like the last vestige of Lucy. She crept through corridors that smelled of lemon oil and dust. A servant lingered by a lamp, one more person whose loyalty went to coin, not to truth. She knew the code to the safe only in an approximate way. She had heard Victor speak numbers to his banker once. She fashioned a passcode from memory and fear, and the raw need to hold something of her mother in her hands. When the safe opened, it was almost a mercy. The urn sat like a small defiant moon in its velvet nest. She touched it as if touching a heartbeat. For a moment she felt as if she could breathe again. She was folding it into the inside of her dress when the house erupted. Heidi's voice materialized like a blade. "What are you doing?" she asked, though everyone in the room knew the answer. The servants, trained to obey, stared. Vivi moved forward with a shriek of indignation that sounded rehearsed. The press arrived with the clatter of expectation, as if there had been a signal. A camera caught the urn slipping, the small cloud of ashes floating and clinging to Tara's dress and hair. Someone snapped a photo of Tara's face in the golden light, a face of surprise, of fear. People would later look at that photograph and read into it whatever they wanted. Malice, impulse, mental breakdown. A woman of the press would call Tara a sensation seeker. Another guest would suggest she had vandalized the memorial as part of a plan to gain sympathy. Tara ran. She fled the house without shoes, clutching her mother's empty box like contraband. She ran through the gardens where statues stared with the neutral judgment of stone. She ran until the stone path gave way to the wild grass of the cliff that overlooked the harbor. Someone had told her once that the sea takes away the things that suffocate you. She did not know if that was true, but on the edge of the cliff, with her dress tangled in brambles and the harbor light winked like an indifferent star, she felt as if the house's voices were chewing through her. The thought that anchored her was less poetic than it should have been. If everything that had been hers was now a headline, perhaps the ocean could make headlines dissolve. She leaned toward the water because leaning felt like an act that could be honest. The sound of the waves was a flat, relentless metronome. When she pitched forward and the sea swallowed her, it was not a performance. It was a collapse. Physical exhaustion and the hot, sheepish shame of a girl who had been humiliated in the rooms where safety had once lived. A man in a dark suit saw her fall. He had been on the pier that evening for reasons of his own. To follow a shipping ledger, to confirm a name discreetly, a part of his method of peeling back the town's polished veneer. He had arrived in the dark because questions demanded that kind of exposure. He had not intended to rescue anyone. The sequence that followed was almost mechanical. A long hand into black water, a weight that made his muscles burn, cold that stole warmth quicker than courage. He hauled her from beneath the surface, and for 3 breaths, he thought the sea had taken her forever. Then she coughed, and a sound like a life reasserting itself traveled through her chest. He dragged her to the dock like a man who had decided to assume a new obligation. When she opened her eyes in the clinic, the bandages smelled of antiseptic and embarrassment. Someone had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders with the efficiency of trained hands. The world was still a little slanted, and people moved like a tableau whose corners hadn't been filled in. He sat across from her on a plastic chair with his hands folded in polite restraint. He watched her as he would study a complicated investment. Slowly, searching for the seams that might reveal truth. "You're safe," he said once more. The words were truer now. She looked at him with a transparency he rarely saw in a room where people hid behind status and small talk. The dam of hurt and cunning and calculation that made her who she was showed in the way she met his gaze. There was a flicker of something that might be defiance, a little smile like the curl of a note before it hits the keys. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "Because I have a car and a driver and a habit of intervening in poorly timed problems," he answered with the self-effacing clarity of a man who guarded an unexpected tenderness with a reflexive joke. "You look like someone who prefers his hands clean," she said. The observation was sharp, not mean. It landed like a piece of truth. He considered protest but did not make it. His hands were not entirely clean. They were calloused by decisions that had consequences. He had also learned that sometimes leverage came wrapped in one person's mess. "We shouldn't be here," she said after a while. "People will say things." He knew what they would say because in his world, reputation was a fragile contract you signed with other people's expectations. The headlines would devour the vulnerability of the night and replay it as spectacle. "If they do," he said, "they will not know the whole story." She blinked at him, wary. "Do you know the Grant family?" she asked, testing, as if names could be armor. He did. Her father's reach had inked over docks and charity boards. He knew the patterns Victor preferred. Secrecy traded for convenience, loyalty replaced with obedience. But Henry, CEO, Heir to a brand his grandfather had started with a handshake and a plan, also had ways to reroute the power of reputations. He had once purchased a headline to protect a project. He had reinvested in reputations like one invests in emerging markets. He would not lie and say his motives were purely benevolent. "There's so much you don't understand," she said instead, the sentence not wholly formed. "My mother," she clamped her hand over the memory like a shield. "They turned everything into a sale. They turned your grief into inventory," he finished for her. He had a vocabulary for such things. That was the skill that had made him who he was. That's their model, but it doesn't have to be yours. Her laugh this time had a fragile edge. "How could you possibly know anything about grief?" she asked. "You have nothing to lose. People like you don't drown in humiliation." He bristled, at once affronted and fascinated. "I know enough," he said. "And I don't plan to let you drown on a headline if you don't want to." A silence fell that felt like a negotiation. She thought of the urn in her dress, the way the ashes had smudged white across her palm, a stain that would not come out with water alone. She felt like a ruined instrument, a brand that people assumed was unfixable. Yet here was a man offering neither charity nor condemnation, merely another kind of currency, protection in exchange for truth. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked. He was a man who worked with facts. Stories were a kind of market he traded in. She hesitated. It was not simply the shame of being humiliated before a crowd. It was the knowledge that every step she took to reclaim what was hers could be turned into a weapon against her. If she answered honestly, she exposed designs and deceptions she had been forced to cultivate. If she kept silent, she swallowed her mother's ashes whole and carried the tide with her alone. "I didn't make the piano hurt me," she said finally. "Someone sabotaged it. Someone wanted me to fail." She let the accusation hang, sour and sharp. "And at the memorial they made me look like I had done it on purpose. My father didn't defend me. He let them decide." Henry's mind, trained to see patterns, slid to the least romantic possibility that matched the facts. The piano had been tampered with by a rival or by someone who benefited from her downfall. The memorial's staged blame suggested inside knowledge. The urns falling and the spill could be clumsy or deliberate. None of it fit the neat pattern of an accident. "And the harbor?" he asked. "Why were you there?" She laughed again, low and brittle. "I went to get away, to be alone, to breathe." Her eyes closed. "And then I thought the water would take me, or maybe I wanted it to. I've been thinking a lot." The confession landed differently when said aloud. She was not a villain melodramatic enough for a soap opera, nor a saint. She was a person forced into choices by a family that politicized grief and sold the remains of the dead as leverage. Henry listened without judgment, which was, in itself, a kind of judgment. He had learned to weigh what things cost. He had a ledger in his head where not everyone was worth the price to rescue. He had saved companies from ruin with a mix of grit and compromise. Something about Tara's story made the cost worth paying because there was an honesty in it that scalded. "There's more than one way to respond," he said. "You can let them fashion your narrative, or you can take pieces back, but to do that, you need a plan." She looked at him with a mixture of desperation and calculation. "I don't have the resources for a plan. I have a tin heart and a box of ashes." "Then I will help you," he said simply. He did not specify how. The words were not a promise of marriage or a white knight's chapter. They were a businessman's agreement that help could be a strategic deployment. He had the means. Legal teams, private investigators, the kind of security personnel who could make a messy evening into a controlled operation. He also had the kind of cold clarity that could turn soap into leverage if need be. She stared at him, suspicion warred with relief. "Why would you do that for me? What do you want?" "For now?" he asked. "To stop you from disappearing into a narrative someone else penned, to see if the thread leads to a place that's worth uncovering." She measured him. "And after?" "After," he said, "we see what the facts allow." She nodded as if the phrase allowed her to breathe a little. The harbor's salt was drying on her skin. The quiet of the clinic felt like a temporary truce. If this story is pulling at you, stay with it. There are truths buried in the next turns that make everything here mean more. They left the clinic with a plan that was neither bold nor brave. Temporary shelter, a lawyer's number on a napkin, the promise of discretion. Henry's assistant, who had the sort of face that betrayed nothing, drove them in a car thick with leather and intention. The city shrank behind them into a smear of sodium light. Tara sat wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of his office and listened to the motion of the tires as if it were a metronome calling her toward a decision. In the back of the car, she clutched the urn like contraband. She imagined the headlines that would be written if the town found her again. Grant daughter found with mother's ashes. Grant scandal deepens. CEO drawn into family feud. She thought of Vivi's face at the memorial, the way the public favored a polished rival over a messy truth. Henry watched her in the rearview mirror. In that reflection he had the face of a man who had saved something he hadn't known he'd wanted. He also had the ledger of obligations the moment he decided to act. He would have to move carefully. That, more than anything, defined him. They did not fall into the tidy romance of candlelit confessions. Instead, they fell into something pragmatic and more dangerous, an agreement born of necessity and curiosity. He offered a hand. She accepted for now, because the harbor had spit her out, and what else was there to do but take a hand when it came? When the car turned onto the private drive of the house he offered, an old estate with modern lines and the kind of security that hummed like an extra pulse, Tara realized she had traded one gilded cage for another. The difference, perhaps, was that this one had been chosen. They passed into rooms that smelled of cedar and paper. Her hands had been wrapped in gauze. The piano in the sitting room looked like an invitation. She touched the keys with the tips of the bandaged fingers and a note sounded, tentative and thin, then resolved into something that suggested possibility. Henry stood near the window where the light pooled like a promise. For the first time since he had moved through the world collecting liabilities and turning them into value, he felt an odd unfitness in the thought that he might find himself protecting someone not because it advanced his company, but because something in her made his breath stop. He told himself it was an emergent market of feeling, an anomaly he could either ignore or exploit. He chose to learn its edges. She sat at the piano with both hands hesitant and found melody in the margins. The sound was not whole. There were missing notes like bruises. But anything can be rehabbed. Any hand can be retrained. Any story can be rewritten with the right kind of stubbornness. Outside, in the town that had tried to name her shame, something else was moving. Ships arrived with crates listed as antiques and curios. Men in cheap suits moved like ciphers at the docks. He had noticed them on nights when he came to see the ledger for reasons businesslike and unrelated to a single sodden rescue. He had been following names, signatures, shipping lines. He had not expected a role in a family's private grief to lead him to the brittle face of a girl who smelled of sea and memory. He had not expected either how quietly a rescue could steal a man. They ate in silence that first night. They did not talk about the future because the future looked like a stacking of improbable risks. They spoke of smaller things, the way sunlight fell on certain chords, the habit of a mother to leave notes in teacups. It was intimate in the way that grief can be intimate when you are both finally truthful about what you have been taught to hide. When Tara finally slept, her breath shallow with exhaustion, Henry lingered. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest and felt protective not because it was his duty, but because it was an insistence he could not argue with. He made a decision then, not dramatic but decisive. He would let curiosity carry him forward. He would use his resources to investigate the shipment lists, to find who had tampered with the piano, to discover whether the spill of ashes was accident or act. He would offer her protection, and in offering it, he would find himself increasingly present at the edges of her life. He did not yet know if he was rescuing Tara or rescuing himself. But the harbor had taught him something. Sometimes you reach down into dark water expecting to pull out debris, and instead you find something that rearranges the architecture of your days. The sea had spat her out. He had pulled her in. The question now was not whether he would help her fight the world, but whether the softness that had entered his calculations would change more than his ledger. They both knew this path would be messy. The grants had been polished in public and brutal behind closed doors. The town had its own economy of secrets, antique shipments that hid other things, Favors bought for a favor's price. Rescue here would be less a heroic sally than a campaign. It would require patience and pain and small betrayals for higher gains. But there was a stubbornness to them both. Tara had the kind of survival instincts that made a person dishonest to keep what mattered. Henry had a strategic mind that measured truth like capital. Together, they might be able to claim agency. The house around them settled into a night that smelled of lemon oil and something else, the small hope that the next day's investigations might reveal a seam. Henry closed the door to the study, leaned on the frame, and for the first time in a long while allowed himself to imagine a life in which someone else's safety mattered more than a quarterly report. He did not know then that in the weeks to come the town would be stripped like a shell, that shipments would be unmasked and reputations would shatter. He did not know that Tara's choices would reveal a moral complexity that would both enthrall and horrify him. He did not know, as he stood there in the quiet dark, that pulling her from the water was the first measure of a debt he would willingly pay. She slept, and the house watched them both like a judge writing down the first facts of a long trial. Outside, waves kept moving in a rhythm older than gossip. The key had been turned. The rescue had happened. What came next was the slow, complicated work of making truth bend toward justice. When morning came, the papers in town were already full of speculation. He read nothing in the headlines. He had learned to rely more on ledgers and phone calls and the staccato truth of shipping manifests. He called a man who owed him a favor at the dock and asked quietly about a crate arriving 3 days ago with customs cleared under an alias. "Nothing you shouldn't be looking at," the man said. "Antiques, apparently, but you know how these things can be." He did. Antiques, by the time you scrubbed them, often hid other things: spare parts, contraband, human lives disguised as cargo. An economist of malfeasance meant to strip the facade. He laid the pieces in his mind like cards: a sabotaged piano, a memorial staged to humiliate, an urn spilled in a flurry of orchestrated attention, a daughter who nearly drowned in despair, and shipments with aliases. It was an ugly chain, but it was a chain that could be followed, and Henry liked following things that did not want to be found. They agreed, in the end, on a first step. Tara would stay under his protection while he looked into the anomalies. She would help from the inside where she could. Names she remembered, servants' backroom gossip, the rhythm of the house that only a child of the household could know. In exchange, he would help her clear her name and, more importantly, ensure no one at the docks could claim she had intended her own disgrace. She accepted with her fingers knotted in the wool of the blanket. Her acceptance was a contract written in a new language neither of them used often. Trust. It was tentative and exercised in small gestures, the way she agreed to meals at the long table and let him walk her to the door of the room he had given her without asking why. She did not yet trust him with everything. She trusted him only enough to let the wound cool in someone else's hands. Days collapsed into a grid of small operations. Henry kept his calendar like a surgeon keeps instruments, precise, immovable. Between board meetings and conference calls, he held private sessions with a man named Marcus Wynne, a retired detective he trusted the way he trusted his legal counsel. Marcus wore the kind of patience that had arrested people and then watched them become smaller when the lights came on. He had a dossier on the Grant household before he ever met Tara: social registers, trust funds, shell companies. Henry fed him the scraps Tara could name: maids who disappeared for half-days, a gardener who knew more about incoming vans than anyone suspected, a bank account with payees listed as maintenance. Tara began to move like someone learning a new instrument. She learned how to listen for names in conversation without sounding like she was eavesdropping. She learned which servants feared Victor and which feared Heidi more. She learned that Vivi kept a small diary in the lining of her glove box. She learned that the safe in Victor's study had an emergency key concealed beneath a chess piece. She learned that the gardener, a man named Jonas, never drank the tea the household served. He kept his own thermos and always left a little of it on the veranda for a stray cat. She gathered gestures and whispers, and when she felt brave, she gathered shards. A receipt from a shipping company tucked behind a ledger, an invoice for antique restoration that paid out to a subsidiary no one could account for. The plan they built was cautious because Henry insisted it be cautious. He did not like the kind of theatrical moves that ruined cases. He liked evidence you could present on paper, the kind that would resist lawyers and the spin of a powerful name. They needed manifests, witness statements, names that could be traced to bank transfers. For each thing Tara brought them, he fashioned a legal step, a subpoena, a quietly placed call to a prosecutor friend, a sanctioned shadow on a shipping route. On a cold Thursday, Tara returned to the Grant house under the pretext of retrieving a locket left in Lucy's room. Her chest hammered with a fear that had nothing to do with the law. The house smelled the same: lemon oil, polished wood, the faint metallic scent of old money. She wore a plain dress and no makeup, an attempt at invisibility. The servants nodded and stepped aside because they did not want to be noticed answering a door to anything but the family's quietly dictated narrative. She let herself in with a key she had not been meant to possess, a borrowed one from a sympathetic maid who owed her a childhood favor. The room where Lucy's things were kept felt like a small shrine that had misfiled its grief. Tara crept to the vanity and checked the drawer where Heidi kept letters and receipts for the household. She found, along with the usual invoices, a small packet wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a strip of paper with a code and a name: Marisol Logistics, Pax 23. She tucked the strip into her palm and turned to leave. At the door she found Vivi standing like a portrait come to life. "Looking for something?" Vivi's voice was soft, perfumed, the way glass sometimes sounds when set against a wristwatch. She held a hand to her throat where a necklace glittered. The light hit it like intent. Tara's stomach dropped. "I left something," she said, aware her voice might be small enough to be safe. Vivi smiled then, and for the first time since the recital, Tara saw a fissure in the perfection. There was exhaustion behind the pale skin, an ache that matched the way her fingers sometimes trembled. "You shouldn't be here, Tara," Vivi said. "People will look for you." Tara swallowed. The packet burned in her palm like a secret. "It's not just for me," she said. "I know things." Vivi's smile didn't change. "Everyone knows things. That doesn't mean they should say them." The moment felt like a scale about to tip. Behind Vivi, the door to Lucy's room stood open and a ray of light slanted across the floor. For a second, the two girls looked less like rivals and more like two instruments that had been tuned to the same broken key. "What do you know about Marisol Logistics?" Tara asked. Vivi's hand hesitated at her necklace, then dropped. "Not much," she said, and the lie was small enough that Tara almost believed it. But Vivi had never been good at hiding things that were too heavy for her to carry alone. Tara remembered the way Vivi's applause at the recital had sharpened into a blade. "I can help you," Vivi said suddenly, and the abruptness made Tara flinch. If you help me with something, I can help you." For a beat, Tara saw a ladder instead of a conspiracy. Maybe Vivi was tired of being used too. Maybe she wanted out. Then Tara thought of Heidi's smile when the urn dropped, and the way Vivi had sobbed with something of a practiced cadence. She thought of the ledger entries, the deliveries, the men at the docks who wore cheap suits and polite manners. She thought of Lucy and the way her mother had believed in music, the way others believe in salvation. They made a bargain that afternoon that would have looked, to an outsider, like the smallest of treacheries, a friendlier face in a family that could not be trusted. Vivi would let Tara see the inside of the conservatory, a private file with patron names, and Tara would share what she knew about Marisol. Neither of them said what they meant by help. Neither of them could. That night, at dinner in Henry's house, the conversation circled around trivialities, a discussion of art that needed restoration, a question about a boardroom luncheon. Tara ate slowly. Marcus had wired the names he'd found into a file that matched the strip of paper she had taken. Henry watched her across the table with an intensity that made her fingers twitch. There was no doubt he knew more than he let on. He knew the names because he had access to ledgers, and because power often wore its clues in the creases of paper. The attempt to silence Tara came unexpectedly and with the subtlety of household cruelty. Heidi invited her to a so-called reconciliation tea under a portrait of Lucy. There were small plates and a thin perfume in the air. Henry had insisted Tara not go alone. He sat in the next room, a distant presence, because appearances mattered, a man protecting a woman without teaching the town gossip another story. Heidi's voice was sugar and steel. "You have been through much, my dear," she said, leaning in, "but you are fragile and people worry." Tara smiled because politeness is sometimes a shield. Her fingers brushed her teacup and she felt a lightness behind her eyes that she had not expected. The tea tasted faintly of bergamot and a bitterness she couldn't place. A warmth widened in her limbs, and then a dizziness tipped her like a ship struck broadside by a wave. The room blurred. Voices softened to the muffled hum of a distant choir. She tried to stand and her knees buckled. Someone caught her, hands that were not gentle. Eyes looked on, some kind, some curious, some openly smug. She tasted metal, felt a buzzing in her ears, and then the world narrowed to a single bright strip of light at the ceiling. She blinked and tried to draw air, but it came thin and shameful. Heidi's face blurred into something older and animal. "Poor darling," she said, which was not a comfort. Henry arrived at the edge of the room like a shadow that resolved into history. He had been on a coal and then found himself pushed forward by a part of him that refused to let cruelty play a long game. He lifted Tara in his arms as if lifting a child. The teacup clinked against porcelain and shattered, and someone murmured about nerves again. When she came to, she was in Henry's study wrapped in a wool blanket and the smell of antiseptic. Zoe Judd was there, kneeling beside the sofa with the practical calm of someone who had inherited a family who knew the cost of fragile lives. Zoe placed a cooling cloth at Tara's temple and checked her pulse like a surgeon who had chosen kindness as a trade. "You were poisoned," Zoe said plainly when Henry pulled Marcus into the doorway. "Not lethal, but enough to knock her out. Possibly a sedative mixed with something to lower blood pressure. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." Tara's mouth formed a small sound that could have been anger or relief. "Heidi," she said. Heidi's explanation later, when confronted, was the kind of lie that smelled of rehearsed innocence. "I would never," she said with the slow blinking of someone who expected to be believed. "She is unwell. I merely suggested she see a physician." Henry did not tell the press what he knew. He wired Marcus to draw the small evidence into a legal framework. The poisoning could become an attempted silencing that connected to the shipments if they found the source of the sedative. It was another piece in the mosaic, a household that used whatever instrument worked. The poisoning hardened Henry's resolve. Wherever the corruption lay, on docks, in bank accounts, in the smiles of the people who controlled public opinion, he would carve his way through. He could see the eddies, the networks. He knew where to push, and where a push would make a ripple that could drown them both. They focused on Marisol Logistics. Tara's scrap of paper led to an office in a warehouse district that punctuated the edge of town like a sore. Henry arranged for surveillance with a team that moved quietly and efficiently. Marcus coordinated with the inspector at customs who agreed to run manifests and to flag any crates arriving under specific designations. Henry used his company as a reason to examine certain shipments. His security teams had reason to verify cargoes for a restoration project. It was convenient. It was legal. It was precise. The first real break came when a manifest turned up not as a single list, but as a palimpsest, an old invoice overlaid with a new alias. On the bill of lading, the declared contents read, "Antique violins assorted." Underneath, someone had scribbled a corrected weight and an internal code, PAX 23. Marcus cross-checked the code and found ledger entries where PAX 23 crept into profit statements billed through a shell company Victor Grant had used for years. Henry went to the prosecutor with the packet, manifests, bank transfers, a timeline of shipments matching a list of departures from a pier on the nights Victor hosted private dinners. The prosecutor, a woman named Lila Cruz, moved with a rigid doggedness. She was not one to be swayed by parties or programs. She took the documents, adjusted her glasses, and asked a single question. "Where's the human link?" "Where's the evidence of people inside?" Henry finished for her. Lila's courtroom instincts hummed. She wanted more than ledgers. She wanted witnesses, testimony, physical proof that would stand up to lawyers with deep pockets. They found it at the docks when a crate was flagged for inspection. The men who worked the pier were careful, but they carried their own small resentments, the kind that grew in the shade of unfair bosses. Jonas the gardener had become an unexpected ally. He had watched vans come and go in the middle of the night and had seen men exit with crates sealed tight. Marcus bribed his loyalty with the promise he would no longer be ignored. Jonas gave the time and place. He had seen 2 masked men carry a crate under a tarp and get it onto a vessel. He did not know what was inside, but he knew the men did not unload it like they did antiques. When the customs team broke the seal, the air that came out smelled of dust and damp clothing, and of people who had been told to be quiet. The presence of human survivors inside a false crate was documented without lurid detail. Men and women, gaunt and disoriented, some with the hollow look of people who had been kept away from daylight and decisions. They were fed, clothed, and put under the care of an aid organization Henry's company had connections with. They were given names, privacy, and the slow, urgent work of re-entry. Word moved differently now. The crates that had once been antique violins were shown as concealments. The paperwork that had protected them was peeled back. Leela Cruz filed charges. Marcus had enough to get a warrant for Victor's estate and for the shipping subsidiary offices tied to Marisol Logistics. The town watched as the shutters closed on a different kind of night. Victor's response was a study in practiced horror. He called meetings and issued denials and hired lawyers whose reputations were made of velvet and steel. "We will cooperate," Victor said publicly with a calm that read like a threat. "There has been a misunderstanding." But the law did not rely on declarations. It relied on ledgers and on the people who had suffered. The prosecutor subpoenaed bank records, tracked wires, and presented a chain of custody that stitched together men, transfers, and crates. For once, the machinations of an elite were not enough to erase the trace of what they had done. The night of the raid that would mark the turning point came like a storm. It was not dramatic in the way film had taught them to expect. There were no dramatic fireworks, just a corridor of lights, a dozen men in plain clothes, and a clipboard that folded into a warrant. They moved with the legality of people who knew the cost of mistakes. Henry watched from the edge of the operation like a man who had learned the value of watching others do the violent labor of justice. He felt, he did not know why, a kinship with the kind of officers who walk into dark rooms and bring light. Victor was arrested for conspiracy, trafficking, falsification of documents. The initial charges were narrow and precise because prosecutors needed something that would stick. Henry had expected denials and counters, and they came, but they came into a courtroom that now had victims prepared to tell their stories, the sober, blunt testimonies that made things real. Tara watched from a back bench when the media season swelled. She had expected to be hoisted onto a champion's shoulders for her role, or to be pilloried for having been the catalyst. Instead, she sat with a new kind of vulnerability. She had lied, and she had lied to survive. For every crumb of truth she gave, there was a chance a lawyer would take that and make it into a sentence. She had engineered passcodes, had helped Marcus place a small recording device in Victor's study, had staged the urn's fall when she thought it might shift suspicion. Those were choices she had made in a room where survival seemed the only currency. Marcus argued for immunity in exchange for cooperation. The prosecutor hesitated. The law is not supposed to reward manipulation, but Leela Cruz was not cruel. She knew that some truths could only be excavated by people who had been forced to climb into the dirt. There was a hearing where Tara stood and told the court what she had done. She spoke with a clarity that surprised even her. She told the truth about the piano, about the acid and the blade hidden in the keys, and about how it felt to be instrument and instrument breaker. She told about the urn and the way grief had been turned into a trading commodity. She did not justify everything. She did not ask for absolution. She gave the facts and let the law decide. The prosecutors recommended leniency in exchange for complete cooperation. It was not a clean escape. Tara faced a probationary period, community service in a shelter for people who had escaped trafficking networks, and a public apology to Vivi and to the family. It was a punishment dressed in restitution. It required Tara to put her shame into something that would benefit others she had once resented. Vivi's testimony surprised people. She wept on the stand, not for theatrics, but because it was the only time anyone in the room had asked her what it felt like to be used. She said she had been groomed by Heidi and Victor into a role where she had little agency. She had accepted favors in exchange for silence. She had not been a mastermind, but a frightened girl who had been taught to protect herself by protecting her family's image. Her words were not absolution. They were a necessary fracture. The family that had once moved like a single mechanism now looked like something with teeth missing. Heidi's involvement came under scrutiny. Evidence linked her to logistics communications, phone calls, coded messages. She claimed ignorance. Her lawyers said she had acted only on counsel, but actions have consequences. She faced charges of obstruction and accessory in the trafficking network. The image of decorum she had cultivated unraveled under the weight of wire transfers and shipping logs. The woman who had once pinned people into places with a smile found herself isolated in a cell of unfashionable light. Victor, of course, fought. He attempted to leverage everything, his alliances, the charities that had benefited from his donations, the donors who preferred not to have scandal stain their names. He tried to mobilize social capital into legal capital, but money can only shield so much when testimony recorded on paper matches a physical sieving of crates that contained people. The law, in its stubborn way, began to apply pressure. There were nights when the town burned with gossip, and nights when the town's eyes softened as people realized the scale of what had been hidden. The harbor smelled different with the knowledge of what had been carried. People who had once applauded the grants at galas now shifted in their seats when the question of complicity whispered around the edges of conversation. Henry's presence through it all was steady, if not uncomplicated. He had expected to be a strategist. He became something else, a witness to the moral cost of power. He attended hearings not as a man trying to curate a victory, but as someone who had made a calculation and was ready to accept its mess. He was there when the survivors first sat on comfortable chairs provided by his company's relief fund. He watched as someone from his staff, usually all blunt efficiency, brought quilts for those who had been cold for too long. Tara's hands were rehabbing with a kind of stubbornness that matched the rest of her. She spent hours in therapy, fingers stirring through exercises that were a conversation between muscle and memory. Zoe Judd came twice a week to check splint adjustments and to coax her into the idea that tenderness could be a repair mechanism. Music became a discipline again, small scales that built into arpeggios that felt like reclamation. When she played a note cleanly, Henry would sometimes appear in the doorway, unannounced, and close the distance between them with a small approving smile. It was not dramatic, it was something steadier, acknowledgement. The night Henry offered her a way forward was not cinematic. There was no loud orchestral swell, only the soft clink of cups as they leaned toward the late hour in the study he now used for personal things as much as business. He had his blazer off, his sleeves rolled. He looked for once, not like a man protected by a company, but like someone who had been worn down and decided he could be worn differently. "I can put you somewhere safer," he said. It was not an old line. He did not promise to fix the past. He offered a future that would be hard work. She looked at him, the lamp catching the tiredness in her eyes. "Safer how?" "Financial independence," he said. "Legal protection. A position at one of my foundations, something with a public face and a real budget. A home away from this town." "You mean marriage?" she asked, the question blunt and careless. The word hung like an instrument unfinished. Henry's laugh was low. "I am offering you a partnership, Tara. I am offering resources. If marriage helps, that's yours to name. But I won't save you with a ring and a press release. I want an honest partnership, one where you have agency and say." She studied him. The world had taught her that offers from men of power either had strings or empty promises. Henry's offer felt like neither. It felt like an instrument being tuned carefully. There was a risk in accepting it. She would be moving into the very world that had polished and harmed her. But there was also a possibility. She could use that space to dismantle what they'd built. "I want to be able to do more than survive," she said. "I want to make sure what happened here doesn't happen to others." He reached out and, in a gesture that was less dramatic than it should have been, and more intimate because of that, he placed his hand over hers. "Then we'll do it together." They did not wed in a cathedral nor sign a contract under a banner. Instead, they walked into a new arrangement that required negotiation and patience. Henry offered Tara a public role at a foundation dedicated to cultural restoration and survivor assistance. It gave her a platform, resources, and the authority to direct funding. It also came with a price, a spotlight. She would be visible in ways that made her skin crawl, and she would be vulnerable in ways that made her stronger. The final public reckoning took place at a benefit the Grants had once hosted. This one belonged to a different set of names and had a different tone. Lila Cruz was there, not as a prosecutor but as someone who understood the weight of justice. Survivors sat at the front, and there were no shuddering cameras aimed at their sorrow, only the kind of quiet photographers used to mental space. Victor watched from a table near the back, his face a map of strategies that had once ruled a room. He had been indicted and arraigned, and had tried and failed to exchange truth for calm. The law had a slow, patient way of dismantling a man who had assumed he could move the world on a whim. The docks hummed with new oversight. Marisol Logistics shell companies had been unmasked and shuttered. People were not entirely whole. The world in those places had been shifted but not made whole. Vivi approached Tara that night and took her hand. It was a hand that once had been an opponent's. "I did a lot of wrong things," Vivi said, voice raw and small. "I was afraid, but I don't want to be afraid anymore." Tara's reply was not a grand absolution. She had learned the difficult work of holding anger and offering boundaries. "I forgive you," she said slowly, "but we will do better." Vivi's face crumpled and she cried then, not for victory, but for the relief of being seen as complex rather than a portrait. In that moment, there was a human repair that no headline could manufacture. The town did not heal all at once. There were families who split, charities that restructured, reputations that faltered. Heidi's indictment meant a long trial where she would either explain herself into a different kind of life or look out a cell window and think of what she had lost. The survivors demanded privacy and then began to demand resources for recovery. Henry and Tara used their new station to make sure those needs were not empty promises. They set up funds, worked with groups that understood the slow work of reintegration, and used Henry's corporate muscle to establish oversight at the docks. Tara returned to the piano with a stubbornness that had a humility to it. Her hands were not the same. There were scars and missing calluses, and a tremor that sometimes required attention. A therapist taught her to breathe between notes, to let mistakes be part of the composition. She learned to play pieces that were shorter and kinder, songs that did not demand feats of virtuosity but asked for honesty. One evening, some months after the events that had unspooled them into public life, Henry found her at the piano. The house he had offered her now felt like a real home, less a fortress and more a place where light could be practical and not performative. The piano had a soft warmth to it. Tara's hands hovered and then moved through a chord that started fragile and built into something more confident. He watched her from the doorway. For a long time, he had felt that the rescue had been an act that complicated his ledger. Now he realized it had rewritten his balance sheet. He had risked influence, reputation, and money to help bring justice to people who had been hidden. In return, he had found a strange and tender obligation to someone who had both broken and built herself. When the piece finished, a short, unpretentious melody, Tara turned to him. The evening light cut across the floor, painting the room in a way that made everything look like a painting after the varnish had been taken off. "You saved me from the water," she said, "but I think what I needed most was someone to keep me from believing I had to make myself a story to survive." Henry's reply was small and true. "And you taught me that some investments aren't measured in dividends," he said. "They're measured in hours and in truth." There was an offer then, and it was not the sort Henry had made in the beginning. He reached for a ring that he had not planned to give but had carried for reasons he himself only half understood. He did not ask her to be his in a way that would remake her into a thing. He asked her to be his partner in a life that held both their broken pieces and possibilities. Tara looked at the ring and then at him. She thought of Lucy and the ash, of the concerts that had been sabotaged and the nights when the harbor had wanted to keep her. She thought of the survivors in the shelter and of the people who were still unnamed. She knew that marriage would not erase the past. She also knew that a partnership could provide a platform to shape a future that might prevent others from drowning in silence. "Yes," she said, not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted to be beside someone who would argue for truth with the same stubbornness she had. They married in a quiet ceremony, more private than public, surrounded by a small circle. Zoe, Marcus, Lila Cruz, Jonas, a few survivors who wanted to witness new beginnings, and Vivi, who chose to stand near Tara as someone who had learned the cost of complicity. There was no fanfare, only a sense of rightness like two instruments resolving a chord. Afterward, life reorganized itself around small, steady things. They set up a foundation that bridged cultural restoration with survivor advocacy. Tara led initiatives to audit shipping lines, to provide safe houses, and to fund therapy programs. Henry used his influence to institute compliance programs and to pressure other businesses in the town to add transparency. They were not saints. They were people who had learned that power could be used for repair as well as for harm. There were nights when Tara still woke with a memory of cold salt in her lungs, and Henry learned to sit awake with her and to hold space without offering platitudes. They argued over strategy and over the best way to spend money. They learned each other's edges. In those smaller fights were the real work of partnership, the negotiations that keep a relationship honest. On a summer evening, months after the arrests and the hearings and the quiet sentences, they packed a small bag and left town. It was not an escape, but a recalibration. They drove past the harbor whose shape had once defined Tara's worst hour and who had now become a place of work they could never abandon. They were leaving to rebuild, to plant seeds in a place unmarked by the old family's shadow. The house they moved to was modest in comparison to the estates they'd known. It had a garden and a small room that would become Tara's studio. The piano lived there, its keys buffed and tempered, and the margin between them and perfection now filled with careful practice. They planted saplings along the yard and sat on the porch at dusk, hands touching the way two people learn to hold one another after storms. The last time they returned to the town was to close out the foundation's first major audit and to check up on people who had been hurt. They found a town altered by consequence, a dock with stricter oversight, a charity with a clearer governance structure, a family that had splintered into pieces that needed to be tended. They did not revel in the downfall of an old guard. They understood the cost of justice, the lives that were exposed, the small kindnesses that had been withheld, the family ties that had been broken. When they left the town for good, it was with a slow resolve. Tara had learned to trust melody again. Henry had learned to make space in his ledger for things that could not be calculated. They carried Lucy's ashes with them, not as a bargaining chip, but as a memory that had been reclaimed from a shelf where it had been used to barter and exchange. They scattered a small portion at sea, where the harbor had once tried to take everything, and had, in the end, returned one person to land. The rest they kept in a place of their choosing, a quiet act of stewardship. Years later, when the Foundation's reports were read, and the reforms at the docks had become a model studied in other towns, people would say that the scandal had been the turning point. They would say Henry's company had done the right thing once the papers were filed. They would say Tara had been brave. None of those things were false, but none of them captured the intimate calculus that had taken place on the piers and in the piano room. What mattered, in the end, was smaller and truer. The sound of her fingers finding a clean chord, the way he learned to carry the heavy silence with him, the way they built a life where neither had to perform suffering to be believed. They took the lessons of shame and folded them into a life that could hold other people, offering money and influence, yes, but also a willingness to listen and to stay. At night, the piano sometimes filled the house with the kind of music that did not demand applause. It was music for living, for making amends with hands that had learned to be careful and bold in equal measure. Henry would sit in the doorway, watching the light move across the keys, feeling the slow settling of a life that had once been governed by headlines. When people asked Tara what it had felt like to be pulled from the water, she would say truthfully that for a long time she had been drowning in the expectations of other people, and that rescue had been both literal and symbolic. She would say there had been debts to pay, legal, moral, and personal, and that settling them had required courage and terrible compromises. She would also say quietly that she had stolen something, a heart perhaps, or a way to hold another's hand, but she would correct the sentiment quickly. It had not been theft. Henry had not lost anything. They had both given pieces away and taken pieces back. They had learned to be other people's harbor, and in the process, to rebuild themselves. If you'd like to follow what happens next to Tara and Henry, how they use the Foundation to change more than just a harbor, subscribe to keep following their story.